Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we're headed to eastern Poland from 1939 to 1941 to discuss the Soviet occupation of the country and its impact on the people there. Hi, Jesse. Another week, another podcast. I know I keep saying this. I know that people have commented upon this in the forums, but I shall just keep saying it. Seems to be my new catchphrase. We're back in Poland. We've done quite a few episodes on Poland, but as I said in the previous episode, in my intro to a previous episode, I think it's important that we talk about Poland because there's a lot of fighting, which often gets overlooked. And of course, Poland has to endure the occupation of both the Germans and the Soviets. And it's really, really time well spent, I think, analyzing both the fighting, but also what happens afterwards, which is the much longer period because the fighting is over relatively quickly. So today, we're shifting our focus from the West, what the Germans did to and with Poland. And we're now swinging the pendulum back to the East to have a look at the Soviet period of occupation, which of course is much shorter because the Soviets occupy the eastern part of Poland, which they of course regarded as their own territory, from 1939 to 1941. Then the Germans invade. And of course, then the Soviets are back in 1944, but that's perhaps, again, a different story. So I think in this episode, we're concentrating very much on the early stages, the early episode, you might say, of this Soviet occupation. And there are a number of famous incidents. I'm just going to throw it out now. Katyn, for example, is perhaps the word that most people have heard of if you've ever dealt with Polish-Soviet relations. So, of course, we're going to explore this. But that's one episode within a much, much bigger picture. So my usual question, as always, where are we taking this to? Where do we start from? Where do we kick it off?
Right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground on Poland, as you said, in some of our previous episodes. I think what's maybe most relevant for diving into the Soviet occupation is, in general, the Soviet approach to new territories and new populations, and also its approach to ethnic Poles who had already been living in the Soviet Union before they extended their borders in 1939. So you have some history between the two. We talked about this in a bit more detail in our episode about the Soviet invasion, but there was, of course, a war between the Second Polish Republic and Bolshevik Russia, 1919 to 1921. That's when Poland set its borders, because of course after the First World War they were very fuzzy on the eastern side, and it's this war between Bolshevik Russia and Poland that sets the border where it ends up being in 1939, which includes, of course, parts of what to the great Russian nationalists or the Soviet government should be Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. And of course, those two should be under their control. So this is the thorn in the Soviet side, so to speak. They also paint Poland as another capitalist, imperialist power with evil landowning aristocrats and with the church playing a prominent role in Polish society. So there's this enmity that's already there. And then, of course, there's opportunism. If Germany's going to do it, we may as well profit from it. So these are some of the things going on in the background. I do think particularly relevant as to the question of what are the Soviets going to do in their occupation is what the Soviets have been doing just before this, during what's often called the Great Terror in 1937-38. So this is a good example of what the Soviets think is the right way to deal with any kind of even perceived differences of opinion or political dissidence. And during the Great Terror, I think it's famous for the military purges where they kill the majority of the marshals and all sorts of generals. But they also crack down on civilian populations. And the group at least according to my memory from, I think, what Timothy Snyder wrote about it, the group that is disproportionately targeted in the Western Soviet Union is the Polish ethnic minority there. And they're repressed. Many of them get shot as supposed spies. Many more are deported to the east, deep into the Soviet Empire, to gulags, so that they can do forced labor there. So this is all a part of the Soviet approach to Poles, even before the invasion and occupation. Now, once the Soviet invasion happens, starting from September 17th, what are the Soviets going to do, right? So, of course, they formally incorporate these territories into the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSRs so that they are a part of the Soviet Union. And then they're worried about their new population, as the Soviets tend to be, right? They're a little bit paranoid about what people might be thinking or doing. And so they begin to crack down. Before I toss it to you, Matthias, for your observations, though, I do want to say there is a part of the population of Poland that thinks that the Soviets coming is not that bad. And we shouldn't sort of paper over that, because we're going to talk a lot about the bad things the Soviets do in Poland, how many people they kill, how many people are unhappy with being under Soviet rule, of course, because they suffer. But at the beginning especially, there are some people who think, actually, the Soviets are going to be better for us than the alternative, which is probably the Germans who are coming from the other direction. Now, you can see some are politically and ideologically motivated. There are some communists in Poland. There are some leftists in Poland. Some of the leftist thinkers are Jews. Some are Polish Catholics. But some of them do think, well, this makes sense. The Soviet Union has a better ideology, has a better basis for how to organize society and the economy. Maybe they don't want to know about the atrocities of the Soviet Union. Maybe they don't know about them and they're kind of naive and blinded, reading propaganda, believing it, hoping for a better future, if we want to give them some credit, right? Hoping for a better future and not realizing the reality of what the Soviet Union is like for most of the people living there. So some of these people on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, be they Catholics or Jews, think, hey, this is going to be good, right? You probably have some other Jews thinking, it can't get worse than the Germans, so maybe this won't be as bad for us. And then you have some ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians who weren't very happy with the way that the Polish government had been treating them. They hadn't been treated as fairly as they thought they deserved in terms of schooling, culture, political influence, equality generally in society. There were independence movements. In particular, there was a stronger Ukrainian independence movement in Second Republic Poland in the 20s and 30s. The famous or infamous Stepan Bandera, Ukrainian nationalist leader, was a part of that movement in Poland at the time and was imprisoned as well by the Poles. So you do have some of these people who think, well, we could be better off. Maybe we will be better off under Soviet rule than we were under Polish rule. So I think it's fair to say that quite a number of these people were disappointed with their experience in the Soviet Union after that. But that is definitely a component to the Soviet occupation. There were some people who welcomed them, at least at first, and then some people who were willing to cooperate with them in the measures that they wanted to take during the occupation against other citizens of the Polish Republic. So with that, I throw it to you.
And that's a very, very important point. Again, it gets overlooked quite often because we look at what happens. I already mentioned the famous episode Katyn. This is the one, and we'll talk about it later on. So the execution of the Polish officers. This is the one that's always seen as the example of the Soviet treatment. And we'll talk about, of course, the harsh treatment, the atrocities that happened later on in this podcast. But you are right. I mean, you have a very specific situation in that part of the world. And again, we need to understand what the map looks like and what are the ethnicities and what are the different population groups in this area at that particular time. It is very difficult to get exact figures, but just as a rough idea, in the area that is then occupied by the Soviets, I always need to look at my notes for this. So the area that the Soviets occupy of Poland, as it had existed in 1939, is actually larger than the area that the Germans occupy. So about 52%, marginally larger than what the Germans occupy, but 52% is now Soviet controlled. It is very different from what you find in the western part. So it's far more agricultural. It's in inverted commas, a bit more of the backwater of Poland. You don't have that much industry, and the ethnic groups are very, very different. Where in the West you've got Poles and German minorities. That's the problem they've got there, and we talked about it in depth and in length and context. In the East, it's very different. You've got a much more a hodgepodge of different groups. And to just throw these out, roughly speaking, as I said, you're looking at around 38% of the population. Let's say 40%, keep it simple, just under half are Poles. It's just over 5 million in this area. But you're also looking at about 37% Ukrainian. So that's nearly as many as Polish people you find there. Then you've got about 40% Belarusians, about 8% Jews, and a very, very small minority of Russians. It's less than 1%. And of course, the German, let's call it the German problem, the German struggle that you have in the West doesn't play a role because that's marginal. That's about 0.5%. So there aren't many. So you can completely take these out of the equation. But as you said, that creates its own sets of complexities. Not only, again, we need to rewind a little bit, and we need to be realistic and objective in our analysis here. So the Polish state as existed in 1939 is not a clear-cut, open, free, Western-style democracy. There is a bit of oppression going on, particularly of these minorities in the Eastern part. Again, you can not understand, but to see why this happens, because these are the territories that the Poles thought should belong to them. Then they occupy these after the Soviet-Polish War, but they know they've got this, let's call it this issue, this problem of all these different factions and these groups who do not feel particularly Polish. And there's quite a bit of oppression going on of trying to keep, for example, the Ukrainians down, and even the Polish the Jewish population. I mean, it probably wasn't the best time to live under Polish occupation. Far better than, for example, under German, obviously. But it's not that everything is a bed of roses. And as you say, you then have this, what these people might see as an opportunity. So the Soviets arrive. Well, that's brilliant. So you already have a Ukrainian Soviet republic. So I'm a Ukrainian, so why wouldn't I go with these guys? That's good. You have the ideology, the political system. So most of these, because it's very rural, are relatively poor peasants. So communism might sound attractive. And as you say, well, how much do they know about what's going on in the Soviet Union? The same applies to a degree to the Jewish population. Again, when you look at a broad brush without going into detail, there's a bit of oppression going on in Poland at that time. And then you look to the Soviet Union without understanding what really happens there. Probably, well, not all the ins and outs. You talked about the purge and all these things. But the Soviet Union, on paper at least, is a nation, is a state where religion doesn't matter. If you want to put a positive spin on this, you go back to the early days of the Russian and the Soviet Revolution. There was a very strong Jewish element there. So you might say, you know what, actually, going with these guys might improve our lives. Why not? As you said, I mean, that's just a thinking that these people might have. So we need to perhaps take off our Western glass and say, well, everything that needs to be happen through a Western view of the world. These guys in that particular situation at that particular time obviously saw that slightly differently. And another group that you then also have, which plays role, is of course refugees that come over into this area and try to get that, particularly while the war is still going on. Because they can still get across, basically running away from the Germans. Again, because they think that living under the Soviet yoke is better than living under the German yoke. And to a large degree, it's about 200,000. Again, the figures are a bit debated, and a large proportion of these are again Jews. Again, changing the whole dynamic there a little bit. I think this is all very, very important stuff. And as we will then explain in a minute, of course, this is going to change quite quickly and quite drastically. But at that particular time, it probably makes sense. And if the options are, who would you rather live under? Is it the Germans with their ideology or the Soviets with their ideology? Before you've experienced any of these, I probably would have gone Soviet as well, to be perfectly honest, because it sounds what's the right word? Not better, but less harsh.
Yeah,
whatever
maybe,
you want to call it. Less evil.
less
I don't know
bad. I don't
whatever
know.
word you want to use, but I think that's a really, really important factor, which also explains a number of, or to a degree, why when the Soviets take over, the takeover is actually, it's quite successful. It happens very quickly. Yes, the incorporation into the Soviet Union. Of course, you're already changing the leading elites in that country, and you bring in the experts, so to speak, from the Soviet Union. That, of course, is there. But I think there was more buy-in into this new regime than we sometimes think there was, particularly if we look at all of this with the benefit of hindsight. We know what happened afterwards. We know what then happened in the later stages of the Second War. We know what happened during the Cold War. We know, and again, we're not really talking about current politics on this podcast, but if we know what's happening in Poland today, these very strong anti-Russian feelings and sentiments that have grown, of course, from, let's really say, well, the occupation in 1939, but then really in the second stage of the war, the Cold War, all these things that happened. If you take all this away because people didn't know this was going to happen, yes, I think probably I would have opted for the Soviet yoke as well, to be perfectly honest.
That is not to say, of course, that 90% of people were thinking this. Just so that listeners and viewers
the lesser of two
clear.
evils, perhaps. That's the
perhaps
point, isn't
in
it?
some senses, and it was perceived that way by some. And for the Ukrainians in particular, I'm not trying to say that the majority of the Ukrainians living in Poland were pro-Soviet. I mean, they knew their relatives had been suffering and dying in the early 1930s because of the Holodomor and so on. But you have some parts of these groups that have different political leanings, that see a potential union with the Soviet Union or takeover by the Soviet Union in a different way than most of the Polish majority. So you do have some elements. We're not trying to say all, we're trying to say some. I just want to make that clear because, of course, this is going to be out there for public consumption. And nuance, friends, is sometimes lost in public commentary and public discussion. We want to make sure we keep that nuance. There were these feelings. It doesn't mean everybody or even a majority had them, but they had an impact. They were there. They had an impact on what happened then with the occupation. So, hey everybody, just a quick break here in our regular programming because I wanted to take a moment once again, as we've done in some previous episodes, to say thank you and to shout out one of our Colonel level supporters, and that is William Noreen from the USA. So thanks so much, William. You are not only letting me and Matthias, as history nerds, kind of live the dream and talk about what we love and what we think is important, but you're also helping us to bring that to a load of other people so they can learn more about World War II. And we hope that's one of the purposes of the podcast. So thank you so much, William, for your support. Thank you to all the other supporters as well. And any of you out there who are thinking of supporting us, by all means, you can do so and help this podcast continue to grow and help us to do what we do. So that's it. And now back to the regular programming. You're quite right, by the way, Matthias, to mention the refugees. Of course, just to be crystal clear, these are Polish and Polish Jewish refugees fleeing from the German sector to the Soviet sector because they think that they will be less badly off. I think that's probably the most accurate way to put it.
Way of putting
nobody
it, yes.
thinks, nobody thinks they're in for a good time under the Soviet Union, except perhaps for a few ideologues who are politically convinced and have drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak. But yeah, the lesser of the evils, perhaps for many. However, Soviet occupation policy doesn't really care that much what your opinion is. And one of the things they start to do is imprison people and deport them. And this is one of the major defining characteristics of the Soviet occupation from 1939 to 1941 is mass deportation. There are others. We'll get to them. You mentioned Katyn Forest, but mass deportation, like this is huge. The Germans don't want the Polish elite to survive. And the Soviets don't want the Polish elite to survive because they're not communist, right? Even the ones who are left of center, socialist leanings, Józef Pilsudski, the first Polish head of state after the First World War and a kind of a hero in Polish history, he led a socialist party, right? So even those people are considered by the Soviets, it's not good enough, right? You're still enemies. You're part of the elite. You're thinking, you're educated. Maybe you don't want to do exactly what we say. Doesn't matter that you're maybe left of center in some of your political views. So the mass deportations begin, and they begin on an extreme scale. I think there are 4 waves, more or less, in 39, 40, and 41, or maybe they start in early 1940, February perhaps. In any case, they target the usual groups: mayors, priests, teachers, lawyers, other politicians, maybe retired or army officers. For serving army officers, they have another solution, which we will get to. But they end up deporting around about 1 million Poles out of the Soviet occupation zone. That's a huge amount of people. I mean, I think the population of Poland in 1939, all of Poland was something like 26, 25 million, something around that. Then if you think, well, most of the population is in the West, the Soviet zone, the population, this is a total guess here, but let's say it's even 10 or 12 million. If you deport 1 million of that, I mean, this is huge. This is, I think, underappreciated in the so-called West. The scope of this, how this destroys a lot of Polish society and Polish culture and the fabric of Polish families. 1 million people sent off to Siberia. Some of them are sent to the typical kind of gulags, and some of them are sent as so-called special settlers, which is a great communist euphemism. So, of course, what an opportunity for you to go and settle an empty piece of bush in Siberia or whatever, or a steppe in Kazakhstan or what have you. So 1 million people are taken away. Some do migrate willingly as well, looking for work, because of course the Polish economy has been destroyed. You have a much larger economy that you're now connected to. So some do leave that way. But it's pretty wild. And it's something that I think we don't think about the impact of enough.
And of course, the whole idea behind this is to, from a Soviet point of view, to break the neck of any potential Polish resistance you might get to this new regime. And the one way is exactly as you explained, is to take the perceived, and that is the term here, troublemakers out and get them somewhere else. At least they're not getting sent to some sort of extermination camps. Well, sometimes you wonder whether the Gulag is much better, but that's a different discussion. At least they're not, most of them at least, and we'll get back to other examples later on, not killed outright. But even though of these, again, the figures really vary. Let's say around about 1 million. Again, they're saying about 100,000, perhaps even more died. So that's already 10%. So that these are, again, as you explained, these are huge numbers that we don't really look at that very often. And of course, hand in hand with this goes then the change in the state structure as well. How can you ensure that once you've removed these troublemakers, that you then have a state organization which links in with the Soviet Union and gives the whole thing just some sort of legitimate appearance? And it's interesting that already on the 22nd of October 1939, so quite quickly after the defeat of the Polish forces, there are elections being held, and of course they're all controlled from exactly
Elections.
all controlled from Moscow and all this. But in these 2 new provinces, so Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, you have these elections, and surprise, surprise, the Soviets win. Isn't that a surprise? So the next step then is also interesting, because you can see how the Soviet mind works to a degree. One of the first things they then do is close down theaters, close down universities. So this whole idea of getting culture, getting education out of the country, and let's use that word, re-educate people, because then shortly afterwards they're opened again, but of course under new management with a very, very different type of, if that's the right word here, indoctrination that's being used. So you can see that's an interesting move, very, very shrewd, well established, well prepared as well. You can't just do all this if you hadn't prepared that beforehand, a couple of weeks after the surrender of the Polish state. And of course, there's one other group and one other faction that is interesting, particularly when you talk about the deportation bit. Again, we'll return to them when we talk about executions, but this is also the military. Now, again, you've got this legal position here, because the Soviet Union never declared war on Poland, and Poland never declared war on the Soviet Union. So technically, these 2 countries are not at war. So what the Soviets do with these prisoners of war that they've got at that stage, while people are saying probably somewhere in the region of about several 100,000 still in Soviet captivity. So these are now seen and treated not as prisoners of war, which comes with some sort of obligation to the holding power and also, well, if that's the right term, rights. But actually they're seen as troublemakers, and they're basically classed as potential enemies of the state. And that, in the Soviet understanding, again gives them the right to either treat them very badly and or also deport this group of people. And it's part of this, the 1 million that you mentioned, but it's an extra group, and I think it's quite interesting. Again, when you look at the legal question, I think in the last episode, or one of the former episodes, we talked about this whole question of legality. How does legality come into these things? And here we have another very good example of stage-managed legality, and you put the veil over some really nasty action. So that's quite interesting. So everything we said earlier about, well, yes, well, in 1939, if you're given the choice, do you go Soviet or do you go German? Well, it's both bad choices. And even those that perhaps not willingly, because they were communists, those who weren't greet the communists with open arms, but those who said, you know what, maybe that's the better option to go here, they had a very rude awakening very quickly as well. And there are people who said that the Soviet occupation in the early stages was just as bad as the Germans. Siebert Montefiore, he wrote about this. He said, well, in total, you have about 500,000 people being killed. Again, we can throw around some numbers. And when you compare this to the killings in the German zone in the early stage, we have to be careful that we only look at the early stage here, because from 1941 to 1944, the Soviets don't occupy any of the Polish territory. There is an argument that in the end, whenever the systems are established, regardless of what people had thought beforehand, the treatment of people and the casualties and the deportation and all this put together, well, perhaps put these two between 1939 and 41 on a relatively equal footing. You might still say one side was worse than the other, but listeners, dear listeners, you get the idea. So it's not that in one territory it was all a bed of roses, the other one was absolutely awful. I think it was pretty harsh and pretty nasty on every side.
No question. And there's a lot of divergence of experience as well. I think, if you're a Jew, you'll definitely take your chances on the Soviet side, no questions asked, right? There's also, I think, something to be said for what happens on the ground in terms of number of people who get killed in this early stage versus what is the future plan? What's the potential for killing that can happen? And there we see a big difference, I think, between the Soviet side and what they had in mind versus the Germans and what they have in mind with their hunger plan and Generalplan Ost and genocidal plans and all of this sort of thing. I do want to point out a couple of groups that we mentioned in passing before, that some of these groups were maybe more likely to think, we're not that happy with the Polish government. Belarusians, Ukrainians, there were some of them who might have looked positively on the Soviets arriving, but they're also subject to deportation. This 1 million people are not only ethnic Poles. There are Ukrainians who are deported. There are Belarusians who are deported. There are even some Jews who are deported by the Soviets under the guise of, well, we're short some skilled tradesmen, artisans or shop owners or whatever, professions where Jews were perhaps overrepresented compared to Poles in Poland. In April 1940, there were Jewish tradesmen included in the deportations to the Eastern Soviet Union. So it's a total mess of experience. And this group of refugees who came from Western Poland to Eastern Poland to escape the Germans, they're full-on targeted by the Soviets. So they absolutely got the short end of the stick, thinking they might be better off. In fact, in June 1940, most of them are deported east because they're considered a possible threat. As you say, the Soviets see threats everywhere. These people they don't know, they're not from the towns where they live now. Maybe they're German agents, maybe they're who knows what. This is how the Soviet system thinks about things, of course. And so they basically, all 200,000 or almost all, get sent east. It's nuts, actually. It's quite, you would think in hindsight, if you're the Soviets, you can turn these people into allies, perhaps. No, there's none of this. I read an interesting account of a Pole who was at first positively disposed towards the Soviets. Of course, he's absolutely shocked and dismayed that the Germans are invading. And then all of a sudden, he's on the road and he sees soldiers, but they're speaking Russian. And he's shocked and he thinks, oh man, the Red Army that I've heard about, this revolutionary Red Army that's for the workers and so on, I've heard positive things about them. They're coming to save us from the evil Germans. So he goes up to them and he breaks out the little bit of Russian that he can use. Maybe he lived in the former Tsarist controlled part of Poland, I don't know. And then they say, he gives this little speech of, oh, I'm so happy that you're here to help us. The Germans are terrible. And the answer is, put your hands up. And that's it. That's the answer, is put your hands up because, we're arresting you. So that's, I find that kind of encapsulates those who were positively disposed often end up having these kinds of experiences as well. Right, not to overburden us with quotes, but I don't know, I like them. I find they're quite interesting to give a little insight of a particular moment. And I have another one here from a peasant woman, this time a peasant Polish woman. Now, we talked a lot about the intelligentsia, intellectuals. We're going to talk about army officers when we get to Katyn forest massacres. But peasants are also being deported. There are some villages that are completely emptied of people in order to go to these so-called resettlements in Siberia or Kazakhstan. And one woman from Poland described a little bit about the moment where they're being told that they're being deported. Her name is Mrs. Maka, all right? Because her first name seems to be giving me a bit of a tongue-twisting problem. So the NKVD officers show up, and this is what happens. This is what she has to say. The hand of the clock was approaching 3 a.m. as it chimed 3 times at a measured pace, and the sense of fear that was growing in me turned out to be justified. I heard heavy steps, the banging of rifle butts, and the word "Откройте," open up in Russian. And those who were the masters of our lives stepped inside. So, if you're any kind of Pole or any kind of person living in the former Poland occupied zone, this is what you can expect at any moment during the occupation. Is middle of the night, NKVD shows up and says, we don't care who you are, we don't care what your explanation is of why you shouldn't, you're coming with us and you're getting on a train. And that's the end of it. And I mean, that is a traumatic experience, obviously, for 1 million people.
Absolutely. I mean, that's not a nice place to be, is it? So there we are. When we talk about the Soviet occupation of Poland, I mean, you can't avoid the one episode. I already mentioned the name earlier of this famous place, Katyn. If you know anything, dear listeners, about Soviet occupation, Polish, Soviet, Polish-Russian relations, this is probably the one term you've heard before. So we can't finish this episode with shedding some light on this as well. So what happens here? So we talked about the problem that the Soviets see with the intelligence in Poland, intelligentsia, so the educated class, and in particular also the officer corps. So they are seen as troublemakers, as counter-revolutionaries, whatever you want to call them. So most of these are still, of the officers now and wider parts of the military in 1940, are still in some sort of camps, not prisoners of war camps, as I said earlier, they're not prisoners of war, but quite often some sort of gulags, really, quite often doing roadworks or whatever they're doing. In 1940, the Politburo, so the government, so to speak, of the Soviet Union, Stalin and 4 or 5 other people decide that they need to deal with the situation. They need to make sure that they take the next step and make sure that these people basically just disappear. What does that mean? You make them disappear? Well, basically means you kill them. So they take them to Katyn, and in April and May 1940, a number of episodes, they shoot somewhere in the region of 22,000 people. It's always known as the end of the Polish officer corps. About half of the Polish officer corps gets executed there. There are other factions, other groups as well. There are civil servants. I think there's even a prince that get executed. So other groups as well. So all from the former, you might say, leading class, the pillars of the Polish state. So they all get shot and executed there. And with that, the Soviets think, you know what, this is over. So they're taking them back into their own territory. So outside of occupied Poland, that's where they shoot them. No one will ever learn. Now, of course, the issue with that approach is that in 1941, the Germans invade. The Germans invade, and from 1941, in that part, there are rumors that there are Polish mass graves somewhere. And the Germans then start investigating. It takes a bit of time because they've got other things to do as well. But in 1943, the Germans find these mass graves. And of course, this is to them an absolute godsend. So the first reaction is, well, what are we going to do with this? Not quite sure. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, then jumps on this and says, well, here's something we can use. We can turn this into a propaganda coup. And he writes in his diary, I can give you the quote, "We are now using the discovery of 12,000 Polish officers," again, the number is too low if you include everybody, "killed by the GPU for anti-Bolshevik propaganda on a grand style. We sent neutral journalists and Polish intellectuals to the spots where they were found. Their reports now reaching us from ahead are gruesome. The Führer has also given permission for us to hand out a drastic news item to the German press. I gave instructions to make the widest possible use of the propaganda material. We shall be able to live on it for a couple of weeks." So, from a German propaganda point, an absolute godsend. The interesting thing is when they put this out, the immediate reaction internationally is predominantly negative. They say, well, that didn't happen. That was the Germans. The Germans invite an international delegation, as Goebbels said in his diary, of the Red Cross, and they inspect all this. And basically, cut a relatively long story short, they come to the conclusion, yes, they've been killed quite a while ago, so this can't be the Germans, so it must have been the Soviets. So that's established at that stage. That has all sorts of implications. First of all, let's face it, for the individuals and their families involved, but also at a bigger scale, political scale. So in 1943, the Soviets had started to engage with the Polish government in exile in London. So they start this in 1941 to talk about the post-war arrangement, how we're going to do all this. In 1943, the Soviets cut these ties to the government in exile because the Polish government in exile is now demanding from the Soviets information on that particular massacre. What happened? Who was it? Was it you? Why? And so on and so forth. So the Soviets say, you know what, we don't need this, and completely cut all these ties, which is one of the reasons, contributing factor, not the only one, but when they then go back into Poland in 1944, they establish this puppet regime. Of course, there are other reasons as well, but it's one factor there as well. And what is absolutely fascinating as well is then if you take this whole story forward, how this has played a role in the understanding of history, the understanding of the World War. And I always use the term the long shadow of World War II, and how this long shadow has overshadowed Polish, for example, Russian-Polish-Soviet relations, because the Soviet Union, all the way to the end of the Soviet Union, always denied that this had been an atrocity committed by the Soviets. And it's only in very recent years that the Russians actually turned around and said, you know what, yes, well, we've got the documents here now, we can see them, they've all been released, they were released, and there was a time of thaw, you might say, when it came to relations with the East, and you could get into archives and look at things. And they admitted to having done that, apologized for it, and that was it. They've now again begun to backpedal on this, and this is now being questioned again in the Russian media. But it's a really interesting example of where this happens, where it shows again the nastiness of the Soviet regime, targeting, to a degree, you might say, a different group from what the Germans would have targeted. I mean, they would have shot them as well, but that wasn't, perhaps you might say, the prime target. Coming back to everything we said earlier about how to organize your sphere of influence, who is the threat to you, and then how this has really overshadowed international relations in that part of the world from a Polish point of view, well, basically all the way up to today. So when you talk to Polish officers, there was in Poland not long ago with the British Army, and you start talking about things, you start, of course, talking about Russia, you start talking about history, it doesn't take particularly long until this particular episode is mentioned to show the nastiness, the brutality of the Soviet / as they would see it, probably still the Russian regime. So an absolutely fascinating story. And it has to be mentioned because it is the most famous episode, or infamous, it's probably the better word, episode of the occupation that you find in the eastern part of Poland before the Germans take over.
And I think, as you say, there are two reasons for why it's so infamous and so meaningful to Polish historical memory. One is, of course, the brutality of it. I mean, they're individually shooting people in the back of the head 22,000 times at close range, often with a pistol in a small room. It's quite brutal just physically. But in addition, because, of course, of what it means, it's an attempt to essentially exterminate an independent thinking Polish nation and community. And that the Soviet Union had that objective and that Germany had that objective is something that many, if not most, Poles have not forgotten and fear in the context of today's politics and relations with Russia as well. There's even a tragic echo of the Katyn massacre that occurred some years ago now. Was it maybe 10 years ago, I think? Katyn itself is today in Belarus, right? And there was some years ago, I'm speaking now just from memory, there was some years ago a delegation, a high-ranking delegation of Poles who were flying there for a commemorative ceremony to remember all of this, and their plane crashed in a storm. And these high-ranking people, there were military on there. I think the president, Kaczynski, one of the two Kaczynski brothers was there. They all died on a trip to commemorate the Katyn massacre. And so, of course, it's given rise to some theories. As far as I know, they're kind of conspiracy theories that this might have been orchestrated by the Belarusian or Russian side. So you can see the suspicion that's there. As far as I know, that hasn't been proven, and that it's more likely it was a combination of bad decisions to attempt to land the plane in a storm and or inability to communicate effectively between the Belarusian air traffic controllers and the Polish crew of the aircraft. So it seems like it was an accident rather than a Russian plot, as far as I know. But nonetheless, you can see the emotions that it brings up, right? That you have this echo.
And there is an interesting extra point to this, you might say. I went to a Polish war memorial not long ago on the outskirts of Warsaw, and this is to commemorate the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, so the turning point of the war. So the Soviets are stopped, are being pushed back. As a consequence of which, we talked about this now over the Poland series, let's call it, the Poles then get the territories in the east. So this is important to Polish historical memory because it's the turning point. This is where basically Central and Western Europe was saved from communism. That's the understanding, that's the idea. And right next to it, in the same area, you have a relatively large memorial to commemorate exactly the story that you just mentioned. So where the plane goes down, you've got all these individuals there and on plinths and kind of their pictures up to go there and to commemorate. And of course, there's a reason as to why this was put there. This doesn't happen out of coincidence because that was the nicest spot. It's creating this legacy. It's creating this link back into history, back into the survival of the Polish state, the struggle of the Polish state. And also, in the Polish understanding, we're moving away from 1939, 1940 now a bit, the importance of Poland as a European state and its contribution it's made to the freedom of Europe. I think that's really, really important. So you can see how, again, all this is intermingled, intertwined, because history is like this, folks. It's complex, it's difficult, context is always key, which in a way is good because that means we can talk about things forever.
Indeed. But we'll try to be slightly shorter than forever for today's episode. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Matthias, for today, or shall we wrap it up for today? All right.
I think that's it.
Listeners, viewers, thank you for sticking with us throughout another episode. We hope that this gave you maybe some new insights or maybe a new way of thinking about what happened in the Soviet occupation zone of Poland in 1939, 40, and 41, marked, as I say, by these cruel mass deportations, and then, of course, the massacre of officers at Katyn. And casts, as Matthias rightly said, a very long shadow still today in the Polish historical memory today. So, if you would like to support us and make sure that we can produce more episodes like this one today, you can do that. You can become a direct supporter of the podcast if you go to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. You can also get, as a podcast supporter, access to some exclusive content that isn't to be found anywhere else in our war room. You can try that all for free for 1 month on a trial basis if you use the code Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see many of you there. Otherwise, we will see you all in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. There we go. We're recording now. Imagine if we did an episode without having hit record. Oh my God.
Yeah, that wouldn't be so good. Oh well.
Happened to us. It happened to us at Real Time History once. Once. And this is what she had to say. Her name is Genofeva. Oh God, I'm gonna have to try that again. Let me put it this way. Apologies to all the Poles out there. Her name is Mrs. Maka.